When the world tries to bend you to its will, it takes an iron resolve to stand your ground and survive. Experience the most inspiring tales of human strength and the ultimate triumph of the spirit over adversity. Hit subscribe today and find your inner strength here. My daughter called me on a Thursday evening in late October, and I almost didn't pick up. I was in the middle of rewiring a junction box in the garage, hands covered in electrical tape residue, and my phone was sitting face down on the workbench. I saw her name light up to the back of the case, and I thought, I'll call her back in 10 minutes. But something made me set down the wire stripper and answer. I don't know what. Just one of those moments where your body decides before your brain does. She said everything was fine. That was the first thing she said before I'd even said hello properly. Dad, everything's fine, I just wanted to hear your voice. And I remember standing there in the garage with the overhead light buzzing and thinking that my daughter, who texts me 3 times a week and calls me on Sundays, and never once opened a phone call with the words, everything's fine. When someone tells you everything is fine, it isn't. My name is Ted Gallagher. I'm 57 years old. I spent 24 years as a senior investigator with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation before I took a buyout package and moved to Rockford to be closer to my daughter and her husband after my wife passed. I reviewed consumer fraud complaints. I coordinated with the FBI on wire fraud cases. I testified in federal court on 3 occasions. I know what people sound like when they're scared and trying not to show it. I have heard that particular register of voice more times than I can count. The one where the person is working to keep everything smooth and level, like someone carrying something fragile and pretending it isn't heavy. My daughter sounded exactly like that on Thursday night. I asked how work was. She said good, things were good, she'd gotten a nice review. I asked about her husband. She said he was fine. I asked if she wanted me to come for dinner on Sunday. She paused, just half a beat too long, and said that would be really nice, actually. Yes, Sunday would be great. She called back 11 minutes later. Dad, she said, and the smoothness was gone. Dad, I think I need you to look at something, but I don't want to talk about it on the phone. I told her I'd be there Sunday at noon, and I'd bring the potato salad she liked. My daughter's name is Renata. She goes by Rennie, has since she was 4 years old and decided Renata was too many syllables for a person her size. She's 31 now, works in hospital administration at a mid-sized regional hospital outside Rockford, and she has her mother's instincts and my stubbornness in roughly equal measure. She married a man named Pierce Albrecht 7 years ago. He's a structural engineer, quiet, steady, the kind of man who reads the manual before assembling furniture and is right to do so. They have a good marriage. I've watched it. You can tell. I drove out Sunday with the potato salad and a lemon cake from the bakery on Elmwood that Rennie has loved since she was a teenager. Pierce opened the door. He shook my hand the way he always does, firm and brief, and then he held the door and didn't quite meet my eyes, and I registered that without reacting to it. We sat at the kitchen table, and Rennie served coffee, and we talked about nothing for about 12 minutes before she reached into the drawer next to the refrigerator and put a manila envelope on the table between us. I didn't want to tell Pierce everything yet, she said. I wanted you to see it first. Pierce looked at her. Something had been going on between them, I could feel it. Not a fight, more like a held breath. Tell me from the beginning, I said. She'd met a woman named Claudine Marsh at a hospital fundraiser 6 months earlier. Claudine was warm, polished, the kind of person who remembers your name and your sister's name, and what you mentioned about your job last time you talked. She worked in private wealth consulting, she said. She'd built a practice around helping healthcare professionals, nurses, administrators, mid-level managers, access investment structures that were normally reserved for clients with 7-figure portfolios. There was a fund she worked with, she explained, a private equity vehicle focused on medical real estate, outpatient facilities, specialty clinic build-outs, the kind of infrastructure that the healthcare system needed desperately and that traditional investors were only starting to pay attention to. It sounded interesting. Rennie had mentioned it to Pierce in passing, and he had shrugged and said it was probably fine to hear more about it. Over the next 2 months, Claudine had become something like a friend. They'd had lunch 3 or 4 times. Claudine had driven her to a real estate open house for one of the properties the fund supposedly held, a converted medical office building in a suburb of Chicago. The building was real. The renovations were real. There were workmen there that day. Rennie had touched the drywall with her own hands, 2 weeks before that Sunday dinner, Claudine had sent her a document, a subscription agreement, 42 pages, for something called the Meridian Healthcare Opportunity Fund, headquartered, according to the letterhead, in Denver, Colorado. I opened the envelope. I put on my reading glasses. I started with page 1. Rennie refilled my coffee without being asked and sat back down and watched me read. The formatting was professional. The language was dense. Somewhere around page 9 I found the disclosure I was looking for, buried in a subordinate clause in the section on fund governance. Investor returns were not guaranteed and were contingent on asset performance as determined by the fund's internal valuation committee. Not an independent auditor, an internal valuation committee. I underlined it with my finger. How much is she asking you to put in? Rennie looked down at her coffee mug. The minimum is $15,000. But she said the preferred allocation, the one that gets the better return, starts at $75,000. Pierce made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Do you have $75,000 liquid right now? I asked. My 403B, she said. It's my retirement account. It has a little over $90,000 in it. I set the document down. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car went by. What made you call me Thursday? I asked. She thought about it. She texted me and asked if I'd made a decision, and I said I needed a little more time, and she said of course, no pressure. But the window for the current intake cycle closes at the end of the month. Rennie looked up, and I don't know. Something about that. The window. I just kept thinking, why does a fund have a window? Why does anyone need me to decide by Halloween? Because that's the lever. That's always the lever. I had explained intake windows and artificial deadlines to a federal grand jury in 2019. Legitimate investment funds do not disappear at the end of the month. Opportunities that evaporate unless you act today are not opportunities. I asked Rennie to pull up everything she had on Claudine Marsh on her laptop. LinkedIn profile, the company website, anything Claudine had emailed her. Pierce made sandwiches while I read. The company website for something called Marsh Capital Partners had been registered 11 months earlier. The About page had a headshot of Claudine, a paragraph about her background in alternative investment consulting, and 3 client testimonials with no last names attached. There was no address beyond the state of Illinois. There was no list of the fund's principals. There was a phone number that rang to a voicemail. I asked Rennie to forward me the 42-page subscription agreement before I left. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table until 1 a.m. The Denver address on the Meridian Healthcare Opportunity Fund letterhead was a suite number at a registered agent service. I pulled the Colorado Secretary of State business database. There was no active entity called the Meridian Healthcare Opportunity Fund registered in Colorado. I checked the SEC's EDAR database. Nothing. I checked Find Ray's broker check for Claudine Marsh. She appeared, and that stopped me, because most fraudsters don't appear in broker check at all. She had been registered with a mid-sized financial advisory firm in the western suburbs until she was terminated 22 months ago. The termination reason listed in the flat bureaucratic language of those filings was client fund misappropriation. The matter had been referred to the Illinois Securities Department. I still had a contact there, a man named Abbott Crane, who had been a senior securities examiner for 15 years. I texted Abbott at 1009 a.m. and said I needed to talk in the morning. He replied at 1014 a.m. He was apparently also awake. Abbott called me at 8. I gave him the names. Claudine Marsh. Meridian Healthcare Opportunity Fund. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hold on." I heard him typing. Then, "Yeah, we know her. We've been trying to build a file on her for 8 months. What have you got?" I told him about Rennie, about the subscription agreement, about the $90,000 in the 403B. I told him about the Halloween deadline. He was quiet again. If she's got a target that close to committing funds, this is the furthest along we've gotten with her. Gordon, every other case, the investors transferred before anyone knew to look. I told him my daughter hadn't transferred anything. "We need her to hold," Abbott said. "Don't spook Marsh. If Marsh thinks anything's wrong, she's in another state before the weekend." I called Rennie from my car in the driveway. She answered on the first ring. She'd been awake too. I told her everything I had found. I told her about the broker check termination and the referral to the Securities Department and the unregistered fund and the registered agent address that cost less per month than her gym membership. I told her about Abbott and what he'd told me. I told her that Claudine Marsh had done this before, and that the people who had come before her had lost real money, money they weren't going to get back, and that my daughter had not lost a single dollar because she had listened to something her gut was telling her about an expiration date on an investment. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "She came to the hospital. She brought me flowers when I had that sinus infection in September. Pierce, too. She called and asked how I was doing. I know. That's the work. That's not incidental to the fraud. That is the fraud. You don't spend 4 months building a relationship and buying flowers for a sick acquaintance as a side project. That is the investment." Claudine Marsh had done the math and determined that a warm, genuine-seeming friendship was worth 4 months of lunches and 1 bouquet of get-well carnations, if the eventual return was $75,000 and a wire transfer to an account in a credit union she would drain in 72 hours. I said that out loud to Rennie, not to be cold, but because I needed her to understand what she had actually been dealing with, what Claudine actually was, before I asked her to sit across from the woman one more time. "What do you need me to do?" Rennie asked. I explained it carefully. In Illinois, a person can record a conversation they are a party to without disclosing that they are recording. Rennie would need to respond to Claudine's last message and tell her she was ready to talk seriously about the fund. She would need to let Claudine make the full pitch, let her describe the fund structure, the projected returns, the transfer process. Ask questions, but neutrally. Be a woman who was almost ready to say yes. Pierce had come into the kitchen while I was talking. I could hear his footsteps and then the creak of a chair. Rennie put me on speaker without saying anything. "What happens to Rennie if something goes wrong?" Pierce asked. His voice was controlled, the way engineers get when they are running structural calculations in their heads. "Nothing goes wrong with her," I said. "She's not doing anything other than having a conversation she would have had anyway. The only difference is that her phone will be recording it. And you'll be there," he said. "Not in the room. But I'll be 2 blocks away in a parking lot." Pierce said okay. I could hear the decision in it. Not enthusiasm, not comfort. Just the determination of a man who had identified the best available option and accepted it. Rennie texted Claudine that afternoon, told her she'd been thinking seriously and wanted to sit down and go over the details one more time before making a decision. Claudine responded within 6 minutes. Warm, unhurried, absolutely nothing in the text that would indicate she had any idea. Anything was different. She suggested Coffee Wednesday morning, a place near the hospital where they'd met before. I drove to Rennie's house Tuesday evening. We sat at the same kitchen table and I walked her through it the way I used to walk young investigators through their first recorded interviews. Keep the phone somewhere she could manage without drawing attention. Screen down on the table or in a jacket pocket. Use the voice memo app, not a call recording. Let Claudine talk. If there was silence, sit in it. People fill silence, and what they fill it with is often the most useful material. Ask clarifying questions in a neutral tone, the tone of someone working through logistics, not skepticism. Don't agree to anything. Don't pick up a pen if she puts documents in front of her. Rennie listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me across the table. "I keep thinking about the open house," she said. She drove me there herself. There were workers there. The building was real. The building was real. The workers were real. In sophisticated fraud, the props are real. The collateral is a photograph of a building, not the building itself. What isn't real is the vehicle. What isn't real is the fund, the account, the regulatory standing, the return. The structure around the real thing is what you're actually buying. And that structure exists only on paper that nobody has verified. I said, the building being real is why this works on smart people. It's supposed to be there. She nodded slowly. I drove to Rockford on Wednesday morning and parked across from a florist on a side street 2 blocks from the coffee shop at 9:15. The meeting was at 10. Rennie texted me when she arrived. I sat in the car with the engine off and watched pigeons organize themselves on a telephone wire and waited. She texted at 11 though too. "I have it. I'm in my car. Calling you now." Her voice was steadier than I expected. She told me that Claudine had been thorough and confident and had not missed a single detail. She had described the fund's target assets, outpatient surgical centers in secondary markets, which she explained were dramatically undervalued relative to their revenue potential. She had projected annual returns of between 19 and 24%. She had described the transfer process: wire to a specific account at a credit union in Arizona, she said, because the fund's treasury operations were handled through a regional institution that offered more favorable terms for private placements than the major commercial banks. She had a transfer form ready. She had a pen. She had told Rennie that the current intake cycle closed Friday. It had moved up from Halloween, now it was Friday, and that she would hate for Rennie to miss the window they'd been working toward together. I called Abbott at 11:15. I won't tell you the exact sequence of what happened after that, because some of it was still active when Rennie was last updated, and some of it is not mine to describe. What I can tell you is that Claudine Marsh was arrested at the coffee shop she had proposed as a meeting location on Friday morning. Rennie knew it was happening because I called her from the parking lot of her office at 7:50 a.m. and told her not to respond to any messages from Claudine and not to leave for any meeting. She sat at her desk and answered emails, and at 11:30 a.m., Abbott texted me 2 words: "She's in." The investigation that followed showed that Claudine had operated variants of the same scheme across Illinois and Wisconsin over a period of 3 years. The Meridian Healthcare Opportunity Fund had no registered assets, no audited financials, no actual investment activity of any kind. The Arizona Credit Union account that Rennie had been given wire transfer instructions for had received deposits from 4 other investors in the preceding 8 months. Combined losses across those investors totaled a little over $310,000. 2 of them were nurses. One was a physical therapist who had been building his retirement for 16 years. One was a hospital administrator in Kenosha, who had put in $82,000 and still didn't understand, at the time the investigators interviewed her, that the money was gone. Rennie didn't lose anything. She was the only one. I drove out to see her the Saturday after it was over. Pierce answered the door the way he had the Sunday before: firm handshake, brief. Except this time he looked me in the eyes and held it for a second longer than usual. I didn't say anything about it. I didn't need to. We had lunch, the 3 of us, at the table where she'd put the manila envelope down in front of me 6 days earlier. Pierce had made soup. It was good. He doesn't cook often, but when he does, he's careful about it. Adds things in the right order, doesn't rush the onions. Rennie was quiet through most of the meal, not the tight, working quiet of before. Something slower. After Pierce cleared the bowls, she looked across the table at me. "I keep thinking about those 4 people," she said. "The ones who already sent the money." "I know. If I hadn't called you," she stopped. She had called me because something felt wrong. She couldn't have told you exactly what, not at first. It was the intake window. It was a deadline attached to something that wasn't supposed to have a deadline. But underneath that, it was something earlier. Some accumulation of small things that her mind had been assembling in the background for weeks, without telling her the conclusion yet. She had listened to that without knowing fully what she was listening to. Most people don't. I told her that. I've watched it for 24 years. The people who lose everything in cases like this don't lose it because they're naive or careless or greedy. They lose it because they feel something is off, and then they spend weeks arguing themselves out of it. They don't want to seem suspicious. They don't want to offend someone who has shown them genuine warmth. They don't want the thing that feels wrong to be wrong, because if it's wrong, then the relationship is wrong and a possibility is gone. And they'd rather hold the possibility a little longer than find out it was false. Claudine Marsh had counted on exactly that. She had calibrated the warmth and the patience and the bouquet of carnations to the specific weight of the doubt she expected Rennie to feel, because she understood that people will spend a long time talking themselves out of a doubt they don't want to have. She was really good, Rennie said, not with admiration, just with the flat recognition you arrive at when you understand something fully. She was. She had done this enough times to get good at it. But Rennie had called me on a Thursday night instead of setting down the phone and going back to whatever she was doing. And that, in the end, is the thread that the whole thing unraveled on. After lunch, I helped Pierce do the dishes, and then we sat in the living room for a while. Rennie fell asleep on the couch, her feet tucked up under her, the way she slept since she was a child. Pierce and I watched part of a football game. I couldn't have told you afterward who was playing. Before I left, Rennie was awake again and standing in the front doorway in her socks. She hugged me longer than she usually does. She's not much of a hugger. She got that from her mother, who wasn't either, which used to frustrate me when they were both alive. I sat in the car in the driveway for a moment before I started it. I have sat across interview tables from some of the most skilled financial predators I will ever encounter. I have reviewed case files that describe the wreckage of people's lives in the flat language of account statements and wire transfer logs. I have trained younger investigators to recognize patterns, to know what language signals fraud, to understand that sophisticated deception isn't distinguished by elaborate mechanics but by the patience and apparent genuineness of the human being executing it. None of that prepared me, not fully, for sitting at my daughter's kitchen table watching her try to understand that someone who had brought her flowers had been doing arithmetic the whole time. There are things I want to say clearly. Fraud like this works because the people running it are good at being human. They don't target people who are foolish or inattentive. They target people who are open to connection, open to the idea that good things are possible, open to the particular warmth of feeling that someone knowledgeable has chosen to let them in. The emotional architecture of the relationship is the mechanism of the fraud. Without it, nobody looks twice at a subscription agreement for an unregistered fund in Colorado. The signs, in retrospect, are often visible. A fund that cannot be verified through the SEC's Edgar database or FINRA's broker check should not receive your money under any circumstances. An investment address that resolves to a registered agent service is not a company headquarters. A return projection above 10 to 12% annually should be a question, and a projection above 15% should be a hard stop. An intake deadline that gives you 2 weeks to commit your retirement savings is not a feature of the opportunity. It is the pressure mechanism of the fraud. You can verify any investment advisor's registration and disciplinary history through FINRA Broker Check at brokercheck.finra.org. It is free. It takes less time than reading this. If the person asking you to move your money cannot be found there, or has findings on their record, that is not a minor administrative detail. And this, if something in you is telling you to slow down, listen to it. Not because your instincts are always right, but because the cost of slowing down is nothing, and the cost of not slowing down in cases like this can be everything. Rennie called me the following Thursday. Regular call, the kind she makes every week. She asked about the junction box in the garage. I told her I'd finally finished rewiring it. She said she was glad I'd answered the phone that night, the night she'd called and told me everything was fine. I said I was glad too. She said, "You knew something was wrong the second I said that, didn't you?" I told her I had a feeling. "That's your instinct," she said. "You always said trust your instincts." I said yes. She was quiet for a second. Then she laughed, small and real. "You're going to tell me this is the one time I did?" I said yes. That's the one time. I've been thinking a lot about cause and effect lately. Not in any grand philosophical sense, just in the practical, ground-level way that you think about things when you spent 2.5 decades watching what happens to people after they make a single decision that can't be undone. Rennie called me on a Thursday because something felt wrong, and she didn't yet have the words for what it was. She called and said everything was fine, which was her way of saying she needed me to hear that something wasn't. That instinct, to reach out, to not sit alone with a doubt, is the thing that made every other thing possible. Without it, there is no investigation. There is no recording. There is no arrest. There is only a wire transfer to an account in Arizona and a woman named Claudine Marsh in a different city by the weekend. I think about the 4 other people. The nurses. The physical therapist in Kenosha who built his retirement over 16 years. They weren't less intelligent than my daughter. They weren't less careful. What they didn't do was make the call. Maybe they felt it and talked themselves out of it. Maybe they wanted the thing that felt wrong to be fine, so they gave it more time, and while they were giving it time, the window closed and the money moved. That's how it works. The doubt doesn't go away. The opportunity does. What I keep coming back to is that courage and intelligence are not the same thing. But in situations like this, you need both working together. The intelligence to notice that something doesn't add up. A fund with no auditor. A deadline that moved up 4 days. A registered address that cost $40 a month. And the courage to act on what you noticed, even when acting on it means admitting that someone who brought you flowers and remembered how you take your coffee had been running a calculation on you the whole time. That second part is harder. I've watched people with sharp minds talk themselves into financial ruin because the emotional cost of acknowledging the truth felt higher than the financial cost of avoiding it. Claudine Marsh understood then. She built her whole operation on it. The warmth and the patience and the get-well carnations weren't incidental. They were the mechanism. They were what made the doubt feel embarrassing rather than protective. Rennie sat across from Claudine at a coffee shop and held herself together for an hour and let the woman describe the full structure of a fraud that was designed to take everything Rennie had spent a decade saving. She went in prepared, stayed level, didn't tip anything. That takes a particular kind of steadiness. Not the absence of anger. She told me later she was angry the entire time, but the ability to hold the anger without letting it show, because showing it would have ended the only chance those 4 other investors had at any form of accountability. That's what I mean by resilience. Not the absence of fear or hurt. The ability to use both of those things without being used by them. Pierce made soup that Saturday. He added things in the right order and didn't rush it. That detail has stayed with me, I'm not sure why. Maybe because it was such an ordinary thing to do in the middle of something that wasn't ordinary at all. Maybe because that's actually what getting through hard things looks like from the outside. Someone making soup carefully while the person they love sits quietly at the table and processes what just happened to her life. Rennie called me the following Thursday. Regular call. She laughed near the end of it, small and real. That's what the right outcome sounds like. Not triumph. Just an ordinary Thursday.